Dennis Nilsen did not kill in a frenzy of rage. He did not kill for money, nor did he kill for the thrill of the chase. He killed for a reason. That is, in its own way, more chilling. He could not bear to be alone. His method was born of a desperate, pathological need to prevent departure. He was a collector, not of objects, but of people. Once someone entered his flat, he made sure they never left. The story of his discovery begins not with a frantic police chase or a dramatic shootout, but with something mundane, almost farcical. In February of 1983, in the quiet, respectable neighborhood of Muswell Hill, the residents of 23 Cranley Gardens, an ordinary apartment block in North London, began to complain. Their drains were blocked. Water backed up in sinks and toilets, accompanied by a foul, unidentifiable odor that clung to the air. The problem seemed to originate from the top-floor flat, the home of a quiet, unassuming civil servant. The plumber, a man named Michael Catron, initially suspected a simple blockage, but as he worked, he made a gruesome discovery. The drain was packed with a fleshy grey substance. At first, he thought it might be chicken parts, illegally dumped by a local restaurant. But then he saw the bones, small, delicate bones that were unmistakably human. The police were called, and the investigation began, leading them to the door of the quiet man in the top-floor flat. A plumber was called. As he worked to clear the pipes in the drain outside the building, he pulled out something thick, grey, and organic, something that was clearly not food waste. He found small, pale fragments of human flesh, tiny, unmistakable pieces of bone, rotting tissue. The quiet, helpful civil servant who lived upstairs, the man who had even helped the plumber find the access point, would soon calmly admit responsibility. His name was Dennis Andrew Nilsen, and this is what was happening inside his mind. The mind of a serial killer is often imagined as a landscape of pure evil, a chaotic whirlwind of hatred and violence. But the mind of Dennis Nilsen was something different. It was a place of quiet, meticulous order, a place where profound loneliness had curdled into a monstrous form of control. To understand what happened in his London flats, we must first travel back to the cold, grey coastline of Scotland, to a childhood where the seeds of this obsession were sown. Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a small, wind-battered fishing town in the northeast of Scotland. It was a place of grey skies and grey seas, a landscape that seemed to breed a certain stoicism, a hardness. His early life was not marked by overt violence or chaos. There was no obvious singular trauma to which one could point, but it was profoundly marked by distance, a chilling, emotional vacuum. His childhood was a portrait of emotional neglect. While he was provided for physically, there was a distinct lack of emotional warmth or connection. He was a quiet, introverted boy, often lost in his own world of fantasy. This internal world became his refuge, a place where he could control the narrative, a place where he was not subject to the whims and departures of others. It was a pattern that would define his life. His parents' marriage was a fragile thing, and it collapsed when he was young. His father, a Norwegian soldier he barely knew, drifted out of his life, becoming little more than a phantom. His mother, left to raise 3 children, was preoccupied and emotionally reserved. Warmth was scarce. Stability was a concept, not a reality. In this cold, emotional landscape, young Dennis found one anchor: his grandfather. His grandfather was patient, quiet, safe. He was a fisherman, a man of the sea, smelling of salt and tobacco. For young Dennis, he represented security, perhaps the only secure attachment he ever truly felt, a port in a relentless storm of uncertainty. Then one day, that security vanished. When Dennis was 6 years old, his grandfather died suddenly of a heart condition while at sea. In a gesture common for the time, family members brought the boy to see the body laid out in an open coffin. He later described the moment with unsettling clarity. He remembered the stillness, the silence, the profound, unshakable peace of the room. His grandfather, no longer able to leave, no longer able to disappear over the horizon. For many children, such a moment is frightening, a first brush with the terrifying finality of death. For Dennis Nilsen, it was something else entirely. It was formative. In that silent room, a grotesque equation was solved in his developing mind. Love, which he associated with his grandfather, was now inextricably linked with death. Stillness meant permanence. The only way to guarantee someone would stay was if they could not move. This was the birth of his macabre philosophy. The living were unreliable, always in motion, always on the verge of departure. The dead, however, were constant. They were perfect companions, silent, still, and eternally present. This twisted association would lie dormant for years, a dark seed, waiting for the right conditions to grow. And as Nilsen navigated the turbulent waters of adolescence, those conditions began to emerge. As he grew older, Nilsen struggled quietly with his identity. He realized he was homosexual at a time when homosexuality was not only stigmatized but criminalized in Britain. This layered another profound sense of isolation onto his already fragile psyche. He felt shame, alienation, and a constant gnawing fear of exposure. Rather than confront these feelings, he buried them deep, constructing a placid, unremarkable exterior. In search of structure, he joined the British Army in 1961. For 11 years, the military provided him with a purpose and a place to hide. He trained as a cook, a role that suited his methodical nature. But during his service, he was also assigned mortuary duties. He handled the bodies of deceased soldiers. He prepared them, he moved them, and once again, he found himself in the quiet company of the dead. He was not disturbed, he was calm, comfortable. Here, there was no judgment, no rejection. The mortuary duties were a formative experience. While others might have been repulsed or disturbed by the work, Nilsen found a strange sense of peace in the presence of the dead. Here, there were no complex emotional demands, no fear of rejection. The bodies were passive, compliant. This experience reinforced the connection he had made in childhood between death and a sense of calm and control. It was a dangerous lesson to learn. The army gave him rules and order, but it could not give him intimacy. His relationships were brief, superficial, often fueled by alcohol and conducted in secret. When partners left him, which they always did, he experienced not just sadness, but a deep, visceral terror of abandonment. That childhood fear, the fear of being left behind, was a wound that never healed. And for Nilsen, it was unbearable. The fear of abandonment was a constant low-level hum beneath the surface of his life. He craved connection, but was terrified of its inevitable end. This paradox created a deep and bitter resentment. He began to see others not as individuals, but as potential sources of pain, agents of his own loneliness. This growing bitterness, combined with his heavy drinking, created a toxic internal environment where his dark fantasies could begin to take root. After leaving the army, he settled in London and secured a job as a civil servant at a job center. To the outside world, he was the model of dreary respectability, reliable, soft-spoken, tidy. Neighbors described him as polite, if a little shy, the kind of man you would trust with your spare keys. He was utterly, devastatingly unremarkable. But behind the closed door of his flat, first at 195 Melrose Avenue and later at 23 Cranley Gardens, loneliness festered like an infection. He drank heavily, methodically, to numb the emptiness. He brought young men home, often vulnerable, often homeless, often intoxicated. He offered them food, warmth, a bed for the night. For a few precious hours, the silence was filled. He was not alone. The young men he targeted were often on the fringes of society, runaways, homeless youths, men struggling with their own sexuality. They were vulnerable, and in their vulnerability, Nilsen saw a reflection of his own. But he also saw an opportunity. These were men who were unlikely to be missed, men whose disappearance might not even be reported. He was a predator who hunted not the strong, but the lost. But morning always came, and morning meant departure. That was the moment he feared most. The moment a guest would stir, stand up, put on their coat, and walk towards the door. Each footstep was a hammer blow to his psyche, echoing the departures of his father, his grandfather, and every lover he had ever known, leaving him behind, alone, again. In December 1978, that fear finally transformed into action. A 19-year-old named Stephen Holmes met Nilsen at a pub. They drank, they talked, they returned to Nilsen's flat on Melrose Avenue. At some point during the night, as was often the case, Holmes passed out from the alcohol. When he woke early and prepared to leave, Nilsen felt a cold panic rising in his chest. He described it later as a sudden, absolute certainty that Holmes would never return, that he would vanish, just like everyone else. So Nilsen acted. He took a necktie and strangled him. It was not an act of fury. There was no frenzy. It was done with a chilling deliberation, a problem-solving logic. When it was over, he did not immediately dispose of the body. Instead, he initiated a ritual that would define his crimes. He sat with the body. He studied it. He spoke to it. In death, Stephen Holmes could no longer abandon him. The silence in the room was no longer threatening. It was controlled. For Nilsen, something had clicked. He had finally found a way to stop people from leaving. He had crossed a threshold. The fantasy had become reality, and he had found it surprisingly easy. The act of killing was not the primary goal. It was a means to an end. The end was the companionship that followed. With Stephen Holmes's body, he had a companion who would not argue, would not judge, and would not leave. The crushing weight of his loneliness was, for a time, lifted. He had found his solution, and now he would repeat it again and again. Over the next 4 years, Dennis Nilsen killed at least 15 young men. His method was consistent. He would meet them in pubs or on the street, targeting those who seemed adrift and unlikely to be missed. He would offer shelter, alcohol, conversation. Then, when they were unconscious from drink or sleep, he would strangle them, sometimes drowning them in a bathtub to ensure death. But death was never the final stage. It was the beginning of his ritual of companionship. He would meticulously bathe the bodies, he would dress them, he would position them in chairs beside him as he watched television, or place them in his bed. He would talk to them for days, sometimes weeks, as though they were responsive partners. In his own disturbing words, he was creating a better friend, one who would listen without judgment, one who would never, ever leave. This was not primarily driven by sexual frenzy, although a necrophilic element was present. It was about absolute control. It was about freezing a moment of connection in time. It was about eliminating the possibility of rejection. Living people disappointed him. They had their own lives, their own desires. They left. The dead did not. For a time, at his ground-floor flat on Melrose Avenue, he had a garden. When the bodies began to decompose, he would bury the remains beneath the soil or burn them on bonfires under the cover of darkness. But in 1981, he was forced to move to the top-floor attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens. No garden, no easy way to conceal what he was doing. Yet the compulsion was too strong to stop. Space became an issue. He stored bodies beneath the floorboards and in wardrobes. As decomposition inevitably advanced, the grim reality of his actions intruded on his fantasy. He began dismembering his victims in the bathtub. It was a methodical, practical, and emotionally detached process. He boiled remains on his stovetop to remove the flesh from the bones and flushed smaller pieces down the toilet. A grotesque domesticity took hold of his life. And yet, during later interviews, Nilsen insisted he felt affection for his victims. He claimed he never intended cruelty. He spoke of the murders as though he were describing failed relationships, not the brutal taking of human life. His psychological detachment was profound. He was living a double life of the most extreme kind. By day, he was a mild-mannered civil servant, helping people find work. By night, he was the master of a macabre household, a silent world of his own creation. The disconnect was staggering. He would go to work, chat with colleagues, and then return home to the bodies he had so carefully arranged. This compartmentalization was a key feature of his psychology, allowing him to maintain his placid exterior while engaging in the most horrific acts. By early 1983, the primitive plumbing system beneath Cranley Gardens could no longer cope with the gruesome burden. When police, alerted by the plumber, arrived at his door, Nilsen was astonishingly calm. He knew the game was over. When officers asked about the remains, he reportedly gestured towards a wardrobe and said, "If you're looking for the body, it's in there." Inside, they found the dismembered remains of 3 men. During questioning, Nilsen was cooperative, measured. He confessed to killing 15, possibly 16 young men. His tone was clinical, almost academic, as if discussing a difficult project he had been working on. He showed officers where he had hidden bones. He drew diagrams of the dismemberment process. There was no hysteria, no outburst, and no visible remorse, only explanation. At his trial in 1983, Dennis Nilsen did not deny the killings. His defense argued for diminished responsibility, claiming a personality disorder had impaired his judgment. But the jury rejected it. He was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder, the charges the prosecution selected from the total, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, he wrote extensively, autobiographical reflections, poetry, attempts to analyze himself. He seemed to crave understanding more than forgiveness. At one point, he made a statement that perhaps reveals more than any psychiatric report ever could. He said, "I hope they find me interesting." That statement lays bare the core of his narcissism. Dennis Nilsen wanted connection, attention, recognition, and in the end, Even infamy was preferable to the unbearable pain of invisibility. His desire to be interesting was a cry for the attention he never felt he received in life. He wanted to be seen, to be understood, even if it was through the lens of his horrific crimes. He saw his story as a tragic one, the story of a lonely man driven to extreme measures. He failed to see or refused to acknowledge the stories of the young men he had murdered. Their lives, their hopes, their futures, all extinguished to satisfy his own desperate need. So, what was happening inside his mind? Nilsen was not a chaotic, frenzied predator. He was a meticulous curator of his own loneliness. He did not stalk strangers in the shadows. He invited them into the light of his home. He created brief, fleeting moments of intimacy and then preserved them in the only way he believed would prevent the inevitable pain of abandonment. Death, to him, meant permanence. Stillness meant safety. Control meant comfort. But in his twisted attempt to eliminate loneliness, he created something far darker. He turned living, breathing human beings into objects. He reduced complex lives to silent companionship, and he convinced himself that this macabre theater was a form of love. Dennis Nilsen died in prison in 2018 from complications following surgery. He never expressed genuine remorse in the way many would expect. He expressed regret for being caught, regret for losing control of his narrative, but not for the acts themselves. He saw his victims as extensions of himself, props in his own tragic play. Because in the chilling logic of his mind, he was not driven by hatred. He was driven by a profound and absolute fear. Fear of being left. Fear of emptiness. Fear of disappearing unnoticed into the quiet anonymity he so carefully cultivated. And so he made sure others could not disappear from him first. He did not kill for pleasure. He killed to silence the deafening echo of his own loneliness. And in doing so, he became one of Britain's most disturbing serial killers. Not because he was loud or theatrical, but because he was quiet, ordinary, and profoundly, monstrously alone. His story is a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones hidden in plain sight, behind a mask of unremarkable normality.